Welcome, everyone, to Cougar Imprints, a brand new podcast here at Kane University, where we are bringing Kane faculty and their expertise directly to you. I'm your host, Dr. Joshua Guitar. Our very first guest in this series is Dr. Tara Schwitzman Gerst. Really happy to have her here for our first episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh.
Of course. So we start everything that I do, we start with pleasantries. And
Okay.
so we start with pleasantries.
All right.
How was your day? How are things going?
Day was good.
How are the kids?
Kids are wild and crazy, and I love them. And yeah, just trying to keep busy.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good. After pleasantries, my order of operations is housekeeping. So is there anything that you'd like to plug? Events that are going on campus, things in your particular major that you want people to know about, or things unique to Kane University that you want to plug?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about is the development of a minor in urban education. So it's currently working its way through the curriculum process, but positioning the minor as open to students in any program. So just if you have an interest in education and urban education, but you don't necessarily want to be a teacher or administrator, please come to us. We'd love to have you. So we're hoping it's ready in the fall of 25. But if not, definitely in the next year or so.
What types of courses might students be able to see in this curriculum?
Yeah, so I just designed a new Foundations of Urban Education class. That's the history of urban ed, how we have urban schools, and sort of the trajectory of that. They'll take another class in education, either in bilingual or special education, because certainly our English language learners and or students with disabilities are also urban students and have unique lived experiences. They'll take two interdisciplinary electives, so either in women and gender studies, sociology, or psychology, and then a final capstone course where they will be doing an original research project in urban education. So I'm really hoping we launch soon.
I love
but
that.
I'm excited about it.
I love that.
It's my other baby besides the babies I have. So
Kane is an urban research institute.
Yes.
This is largely, though, for probably K through 12 persons who are going to be K through 12 educators.
I mean, really, it's open to anyone who's interested in schools. So,
okay.
I mean, the philosophy behind the minor is that we all impact schools, whether we're teachers or not. If you're a lawyer, if you're a politician, if you're a journalist, like we all have a stake in what happens in schools. And so it's really meant for a broad audience. So you definitely don't need to be interested in being a teacher, but if you're interested in society and the way the world works and learning, where you are in all of that, that's the place for you. So we're trying to kind of position schools and education as fields worthy of study and exploration, in addition to preparing teachers and principals and other school-based personnel.
That sounds like an awesome program. I
Yeah,
mean
thank
that
you.
sincerely. That's
Thanks,
really interesting.
thanks. I'm hoping we get it off soon.
I will plug it to my students.
Yes, thank you.
Very cool. We'll look for courses in the fall.
Yes.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Not gonna wood.
Awesome. Well, let's move on to the content area, the crux. We have a research article that you've recently published. We'll get into that soon. That's the real spotlight for the day. But first, let's get to know Dr. Tara Schwitzman Gerst, the person. Who are you as a human? And then we'll move to you as a scholar.
Oh, as a human?
Yeah.
Like,
what makes you you?
What makes me me? I think.
What's your life story? Outside of academia, what's your life story?
Outside of academia, what is my life story? I think I'm someone who is always trying to expand what I know and learn more about the way the world works and why. I care deeply about humans, other humans, and wanting everyone to have access to living their best life, as simple as that kind of sounds.
As the kids say.
And I think that I became a teacher like right out of college, and being a teacher really is still foundational to who I am. As you could probably tell by the way I spoke about the minor and education. And so I really view the world through the lens of a teacher, even though I'm not currently in that setting. Certainly as a mom, I kind of use what I learned as a teacher as well. And other than that, I was a music major. So I'm a musician by training. And so I feel like the arts help me understand and express things that cannot be said. And I'm also a former long distance runner. So I think that colors the way I see the world. And I mean, those are all disparate pieces of who I am.
Those are all great.
But at our core, I want to honor everyone's humanity, I guess. So
if I may, your passion comes through very authentically. I like that, especially for
good.
teaching. I felt it. Were there instruments or were vocal? What part of...
So my degree, I play a lot of like Western instruments. My degree, I have 2 bachelor's degrees, one in psychology, and one in music performance. So I'm a trained opera singer, although I don't really do that anymore. But that allowed me to study abroad, see the world. And then when I started teaching, I certainly taught opera to my students, but I realized that the way I had been taught music was just very narrow. So I got on a plane and flew to Ghana and studied music in a village in West Africa.
Wow.
And then brought that back to my students and really tried to emphasize world musics. And I had to like forget everything that I learned in my music degree to actually be able to do the West African music that I was studying. And it became such a metaphor, right? Like in order for us to grow, sometimes we have to, and as a researcher, I very much like, I have to unlearn the lit sometimes to get at what my participants are actually saying. And so, and of course, like, you know, people would say like, oh, well, you teach in Philly, like those kids must like, you know, African drumming. And I'm like, well, all kids should be exposed to this. And I also teach my kids the opera and the violin, etc. So, and then I found randomly in Philly a group that was playing that tradition of West African music, which is very niche. And I was able to like gig for a while before I eventually moved to New York City and got consumed by graduate school. And so I haven't like gigged as much. But certainly the way I view schools and education is through that broader, I was the music teacher, right? So I taught every kid in the school, worked with every teacher. So I have sort of like I'm not a specialist when it comes to education. I'm more of like, what's the broader picture? How do we support students and teachers? And I've kind of always been that way in my research as well. So
this trip to Ghana was a study abroad experience, or you just did this?
I was at a professional development my first year teaching, realizing like something's not working, and they will always have like PD flyers everywhere. And there was like at the very, you know, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but the very end of the table, it was like, go with UMass Amherst to Ghana. And I was like 23. I'm like, okay, sure. So it was study abroad, but not like attached to like a university. It was like I got university credits, but we didn't like go to class. We were in a very remote part of Ghana, living in a village, like set up for people to come, you know, learn music, but not in any sort of like other westernized setting, if that makes sense.
It does. And we both do work that tries to decenter the Western scope. And you're right. The unlearning processes
they're deep.
Important challenge.
Yes.
Important challenge.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Thanks.
Great story. And you, I happen to know you're a mother of 3.
Yes.
So you want to give them some love, or?
Oh yeah. Mother of 3, under 3. So, my daughter Nora is, she goes to the Kane Child Care Center. She, you know, I was pregnant with her and I defended my dissertation.
Wow.
So she was there with me.
Wow.
And actually I had such a writing block because of this unlearning process. So like I was so attached to the literature that I had read about what my participants were doing or not doing in their teaching. And I really struggled. You know, my advisor really pushed me. At the time I didn't love her for it, but I love her now for it. And she was like, we just have your critique. Like, what can we learn from these people? You need to just like set aside what you already know. And I was really stuck with it. And also because I was also struggling to get pregnant as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And like, I got pregnant, my chapter 6 came to me, but also it's like, I have to finish this thing because I'm about to graduate. And then, I got my offer from Kane like 2 weeks before Nora was born. So like the timing, like I was, So my dissertation is dedicated to Nora and also to my grandparents who are still alive and Holocaust survivors.
Wow.
And my Zaidi will be 100 years old at the end of this month. And sort of their survival is why I do what I do. Right. And you know, I can't say it more clearly than that. And then we wanted to give Nora a sibling and instead we gave her 2. So my son and daughter, Felix and Shay, were born last May. So they're almost they're 8.5 months old, which is
I'll say
kind of wild.
a couple things. Number one, I'm a crier, and the tears are welling with your story, and now I'm getting self-conscious being on camera. But this is a fantastic story. Is Nora a co-author? I feel like she should be a co-author of that chapter.
She
gets
could
an acknowledgement line.
I mean, she could if I gave her the pen to do it. As you've met Nora, she's very strong-willed, a little bit stubborn and independent, and
she's found her voice.
She is definitely she is a talker. Yes, and I do support it. So I've learned a lot about teaching through being a mom. When I was a teacher, I wasn't a mom. And so now I try to bring that into my teaching with students here. Because I can certainly, now I'm really on both sides of it, right? And so, and as a parent, I always support the teacher, right? I'm not going to be a parent that's like, that's not my kid. Like, I believe you, that's my kid, right? But I do try to always remind students of that and humanize their parents, and that, I mean, you're a parent too. As parents, we're doing the best that we can, and we're all just doing the best that we can in life. And I try to, yes, these problems in schools are urgent and we need to fix them, but we also need to humanize everyone in schools. And I try to bring that through in my work and also just in my teaching here with our students who are wonderful and very much on board with the conversation, I must say.
My students humanized me this morning by telling me how tired I looked.
There you go.
I have a 2-year-old.
I never know what to say when it's like, you look tired. I'm like, thanks.
Well, this is my life.
Right.
I write and take care of a 2.5-year-old.
Right.
So wonderful. So a number of times in this so far, you've mentioned kind of your academic trajectory. So let's get into Dr. Tara Schwitzman-Gerst, the scholar. Give us your trajectory. I know you've given us a little bit already, but what brought you to Kean? What intrigues you as a scholar? What drives you?
Yeah. So I'm interested, the crux of my scholarship coming out of graduate school was around we need more teachers of color in our schools. That's well researched, like the positive effects that teachers of color have, not just on students of color, but students of all white students as well. But when you start to dig into the weeds of what's the problem and why we don't have teachers of color, like anything else, it gets very complicated. But I became interested, one, in how do we graduate teachers of color, but two, how do we make sure that they're really prepared for what's happening in their schools and not making this assumption that because you are a Black college student and because you're a Black teacher, it means you know what to do in the classroom, because that's denying a kind of education as well. I happened to be working at a Hispanic serving institution at the time that I became interested in this phenomenon, and noticing that there was a lot of essentializing narratives about pre-service teachers and students of color. And that wasn't my experience working with students at HSIs. And so that has sort of led a research interest around institutionally, how do HSIs graduate teachers of color in teacher educators' classrooms? How are they addressing issues of diversity and equity? And then what are the larger diversity and equity issues in K-12 education? So really, I'm interested in equity in teacher ed, but these different pieces, sort of the institutional component, then within the college classroom, how we're talking about it, and then what are the issues in K-12, but all through this lens of problematizing my methods. And one strand of my research is around qualitative methods and like how some of those have become subsumed by post-positivist epistemologies that reproduce the very problems we were trying to like undo with qualitative research. So I have a methods piece coming that's in the pipeline. Hopefully it comes out eventually. And so what interested me about Kean, of course, is that it is an HSI. And it was really important to me to be working at an institution serving that kind of population that was interested in becoming teachers. And as I'm getting away from my dissertation, as you know, I'm a newer, grad school, I graduated 2.5 years ago. So it's still recent.
Columbia.
Yes. I'm interested in sort of the intersections between lived experience and how we understand issues of equity and what our lived experiences can and can't tell us. So I'm wrapping up a study right now about pre-service and in-service teachers who had received special education services as students, and then like how their experiences are informing their teaching. And I'm really excited about some of the findings because they're really troubling a lot of, in the ed world, things that we've taken for granted. And so I think, you know, I always want to keep kind of problematizing, like, what does equity mean? What does justice mean? And who's defining it? And so that's really like the crux of who I am as a scholar and my trajectory from that. So starting another project in the fall around similar line. So I'm excited about that.
You stole my next question, or you've already asked it. And what is equity? I mean, these
Right, yes.
terms like equity, and we hear them a lot now in contemporary media, political discourse. I think there's a lot, as someone who also does a lot of critical work, there's a lot of misconception about these ideas and what they are intended to do. So in your mind, as you're studying equity and how we can best actualize it, what does that mean?
I mean, Josh, I'm still trying to figure that out.
Well, this is your life mission, so that's good.
Yeah, but I'm not going to define it because I think I would need a lot more time to answer that question. But what I will say is that and one thing that I really have learned is that we can't keep static on what that definition can't stay static. It has to evolve with what's around us. And we can't, when we look at how equity and justice have been defined in the past, we can't apply what we know to then, right? And just sort of, it has to be a stance that's constant. Equity is a stance, it's not a thing, right? And it has to constantly evolve with the needs of whoever's being impacted, right? And so I will say that I'm certainly a critic of schools, and because our schools and our education system have not worked for so many people, and we can't keep doing the same things over and over. But I also do believe that education will change the world. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. So it's not an answer to your question, but it's the things I think about, right? Yeah.
I think you've conceptualized it well. And maybe I shouldn't have said define, but conceptualize or give us a feel for what it means for you. So, and I think, well, so we'll jump in. One of the features that we'll do with this podcast is bring in scholars like yourself who have recently had something that's, I think, worth celebrating. For many of us as researchers, that's a publication, because these oftentimes take years to get to print, right?
Yes.
But for persons in the creative arts, it could be a film festival where they feature their work at. But you've had an article recently published in the Journal for Multicultural Education. The title of that piece is a little longer, but I'm going to read it to give it its due. Diversity's Invisibility, the "in" is in parentheses, at 2 Hispanic serving institutions, how the whiteness of higher education constrains racially diversifying the K-12 teaching force. I had you send this to me, and I'll say a couple things. Number one, and I mean this, you're a really good writer. Like this was compelling arguments, and just the authorship. I think is really strong. In addition, great, fascinating study, interesting argument. So if you could walk us through this particular research project for us, certainly don't dumb down your work and your expertise, but our goal here is to bring your scholarship to the wonderful Kane community and give them a sense of what we do as faculty.
Yeah, so this was a piece stemming from my dissertation, which was a very large qualitative study with all kinds of data that was looking at the role of Hispanic serving institutions in, as I said, graduating and preparing our teachers. And the dissertation kind of had 2 parts to it. So this one was really talking about the institutional piece. And what I was trying to do in this article is bring the scholarship worlds of teacher education and higher education together. Because often we talk about the problems of graduating teachers, like the praxis, our licensure exams, and all these other very teacher-specific issues. And then we also have sort of scholarship on like college students of color and faculty of color and their experiences in higher ed. But rarely, in my experience, do these worlds come together. So in this article, what I'm trying to show is like, you know, colleges of education can be doing all this like wonderful, innovative stuff. But our faculty, our teacher educators are still faculty, and our pre-service teachers or students are still college students having those kinds of experiences in other facets of the university. So for faculty around tenure and promotion, which I try to argue there, it has a big implication for pedagogy, because as teachers, as professors of teachers, they learn a lot about teaching through us and what we're doing in our classroom, just modeling it, right? So if if I'm stressed out about tenure and writing and I can't like spend as much time on teaching, yeah, that matters for my students, but I'm trying to argue that it matters for their students too, because that's less time that I can spend in class to like play with different strategies or really get into things if I'm just trying to like survive the tenure track, right? Or whatever it is. So that's what I'm trying to do in that article for both faculty and students, showing that, you know, in some ways these institutions were highlighting diversity, but they were missing the ball in other ways, right? So around, we need to restructure scholarships differently. We need to think about how we're supporting our students who are also like parents and low income and all of these other issues that they're having outside of the College of Ed, but that inevitably impact their experience in their teacher prep program.
Yeah. I think there are multiple things I love about this article. I mean, one of them, and it's coming through quite clearly with your conversation, is that you're not just doing work for the proverbial ivory tower, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we're doing research because we just love doing research, and I love it too. And I might just do it for fun because it's fun, but you really do see a real world influence for your work. How do you see, like, what if you were to make recommendations based on your research for influencing the institutional components of K through 12 or higher education to help advance some of these initiatives that you're seeing? What would that look like?
I mean, I think that colleges of education have a lot to offer pedagogically. So one thing that is mentioned in the article, but I think about is like, you know, someone who wants to be a teacher, if they can't get through their gen ed classes, they're being academically dismissed before they even get to their education courses that they might be really excited about. So I think the academic supports need to start earlier, and we need to go to our College of Ed faculty because they've taught K-12. You know, one of my participants says this, right? That like the people who've taught K-12 are the best people to teach students at this institution who were underserved as K-12 students. Like we have that expertise, and I think sort of disseminating that, you know, it would definitely be a recommendation that I have.
Yeah.
I think in terms, you know, I love research too, and I know. And I appreciate that it's part of the tenure process. For those of us working in applied fields like education, we need to we need some kind of way, not to maybe change the tenure process, but recognize that, you know, we're training future practitioners, and we need to be able to like go into schools and find ways to kind of change the tenure process to more accurately reflect you know, our identity as teacher educators. And I'm working on a paper now around teacher educator identity. I'm using the word teacher educator intentionally, right? Because many of us as professors in colleges of ed, our identities is through our work as teachers, right? Like I said to you earlier, like I am always like, I'm an elementary school teacher. I can, you know, write all these papers and do this research, but that's like who I am at my core. And I think a lot of the research shows that a lot of teacher educators feel that way. I know a lot of my colleagues feel that way. And so how do we have a tenure process that reflects that?
Fascinating.
Yeah.
If you had to walk us through a bit the start to finish of this, I know it was a part of your dissertation, which makes it a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
But you interviewed participants. Can you kind of, for those of us in the audience who aren't necessarily familiar with, say, qualitative methods or interviewing, what did that look like for you as you conducted maybe this component of the research?
So this component of the research drew on mostly the interview data. Okay. So the professors were my focal participants. So I did 3 separate interviews with them during the semester the study took place. Once at the beginning of the semester, once in the middle, once at the end. This really drew more on the 3rd interview, which was some of the questions around being an HSI and like what that means, because there were other aspects of the study. I did 1 interview with a few students in their courses, and those interviews again focused on like the other part of the study, but also this like, what's it like to be a student here? What do you love about it? What's challenging? And that's where some of the things came up that they shared around ways that they were not being supported. This piece, I really was trying to do a lot of like document analysis. Okay. So looking at the institution's websites, how they were communicating their mission as an institution, as a college of education, and then lots of different kinds of reports that colleges of ed have, that the institution has around some of the things that I cited around percentage of faculty by race and tenure status and things of that nature. So the larger study had observational data from the teaching, but was not appropriate to this research question. So I didn't include it in this paper. So that, for our listeners, like in large qualitative studies, we collect a lot of data, and sometimes, we pick and choose what we're going to include in the paper, just because we want to keep the argument super clear about, what we're trying to say.
And here, when you say data, you mean it's not like you're pulling numbers and running.
Correct. Yes.
You are talking about like interview
Right.
transcripts.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
and
So, I mean, there are some numbers there with like the percentage of faculty that have tenure or whatnot, but like the focus for us for me is always, the interview transcripts. The numbers kind of help support what they're saying, but it's definitely not mixed methods where you do like a quantitative analysis and a qualitative. And one of the papers that I'm currently working on is around sort of how in qualitative research, like coding the data has become ways to just like quantify it again. So I'm always trying to find different analytic techniques to get out of that, like, I must like find the capital T truth. And that's what's really cool about qualitative research, because I had one of the participants in that study, and I was like, I really feel like he's saying something important, but I don't know how to share that. I got one frame, so one body of literature, right? Because as you know, in research, you can't just say something because it's a cool thing to say. It has to be in conversation with what other people are saying. So I tried one body of literature, rejection, tried another body of literature, rejected. So I reached out to a colleague, and I was like I said, I think this guy's like saying something. I don't know how to frame it. And she was like, how about we try this like teacher identity framework? And I went back to these transcripts which I have, they're now 5 years old, right? Like, and I've listened to them and like I could recite them all to you at this point, and they're long. And I saw things in the data that I never saw before. And I mean that sincerely. And I was like,
just with a new lens.
Right. And I'm like, this is why qualitative work is so cool, because there's this conception sometimes that like, oh, we do like one study and then it's over. And it's like, actually, no, you can go back to the data and just like frame it differently and find something new. And then we end up in a lot of rabbit holes that way.
Another thing I love about this piece is that you're getting at some what have become difficult political or social talking points, right? And I think they're becoming difficult because of those various ideologies that are vying for power external to our world of education and research, right? Things like an ideology of whiteness, which you interrogate here. Things like equity, inclusion, access. And you mentioned early in our conversation how important those things are for students to succeed. And we have verifiable evidence to back that up, that having teachers of color matter, right? Not just for students of color, but for all students. So could you, this isn't a political platform by any stretch, but for students or persons in the community who might be caught up in some of that tension about like restricting or advocating for DEI or whatever the buzzwords are, how do we ground ourselves here and really demonstrate the importance of work like this?
I think work like this just shows, the piece uses intersectionality. So it's trying. So some of the critique against DEI is very like unidimensional, right? That people are this one race or this one gender, but people are a lot of different things, right? And so the participants, like that's sort of what gets lost sometimes, that we have at HSIs, we have Hispanic students who are also parents or veterans or all these other identities. And so I think, to maybe depoliticize, if that's what you're trying to say, I would just say we need to listen a little more carefully to what people need and actually maybe not put people in boxes, because I think that's what the critics are upset about, is that you're putting people in boxes. And I actually think this piece is saying the same thing. If you put student in boxes, like you're a low-income student or you're a Hispanic student or you're this, you're missing some of what they need. And similarly with our faculty as well. So I actually think, yes, I purposely use words like whiteness and equity, but those, and I wouldn't advocate for stripping away that language, but I do think behind some of that is some of the same sort of critique that we might be seeing now around DEI.
I think that's a really important point, and a lot of critical work, and I'm not sure that you would classify yourself. Will you classify your work as critically inclined?
Yeah,
Or-
I would. Yeah.
that it's important not just to, as you say, problematize the institutions that seem like the biggest offenders, but also to say like, hey, in trying to do DEI, we're not always doing it well,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're trying to
yeah.
actualize these core ethics and values. Where are we, even if we're trying to do the right thing, where are we struggling? It
Right,
seems that you're
right.
also trying to flesh that out.
Oh
here,
yeah,
and that's
yeah. We have a lot
really
of work
important.
to do,
Yeah.
right? And I'll be the first to admit that, right? So I mean, I'm always kind of like not skeptical, but when there is a new equity initiative, I'm like, okay, like who might be left out right now? Not as a critique, but as like that's our responsibility to think in that way, or as you're saying, the intentions and the purpose get lost.
So what's next on the horizon? You mentioned a couple of pieces that you've been working on.
Yes.
Is there research you're building from this specific study? Where can we see your name
Yeah.
future in publications?
So I have a piece under review that is about, that is sort of, if you want to think of the other part of the dissertation, which is the classroom pedagogy piece.
Mm-hmm.
And how professors, teacher educators of color are addressing whiteness in their teaching. And I do think they nuance a lot of things very well. So I'm hopeful that the reviewers see it that way. I've got this piece, this methods piece that's in a revise and resubmit, holding cell right now.
In our purgatory.
But that talks about, the analysis. So I actually show like, here's where my findings when I coded my data. Here are my findings when I used what I call like a playwriting as analysis. And here's how that changed. Also interrogating the ways in which qualitative researchers talk about positionality. So we talk about who I am affects the data, but I argue in this piece, the way that we interrogate positionality is too flat, and we need to be doing it in better analytic ways. So that's in the revise and resubmit stage. I'm preparing 2 manuscripts right now. One is that study about the teachers who had IEPs themselves, hopefully submitting at the end of this academic year, and then the teacher educator identity piece. So looking at that same data, but through this lens of teacher educator identity and how their teacher selves like impact their work. And then in the fall, I'm starting a study with my colleague, Dr. Alex Guzman in Department of Ed Leadership around Latino male teacher educators at HSIs and what their lived experiences can tell us about the pedagogical and institutional practices that can support both Latino male teacher educators and Latino male college students who want to be teachers or administrators in schools. So that'll be a new project starting in the fall. So lots to do and not enough time.
As we do. Just there's something at every stage.
Exactly.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm honored that you were the first guest.
I'm honored you asked me to be here.
We got to have this conversation. I feel like I could continue with this conversation for another few hours, but I also want to respect your time because we had a kind of a window that we said we would try and fit this in. I appreciate you taking that time out of your busy schedule of writing, teaching, and the most important job of all, taking care of those beautiful.
Yes.
Beautiful
Well, thank you
children
for
of
your
yours.
work, Josh, and for asking me.
Yeah, of course. All right. So, Dr. Tara Schwitzman-Gurst, thank you so much. To everyone who took the time to watch and listen for this long, thank you so much. I don't know what do you like, subscribe, follow, all the fun things, do all the verbs, right? Do all that for us. And we will have more episodes up soon on all of our platforms. If you have an idea or you want to be featured, send me an email.